Today's date is Thursday, April 3rd, 2025. And for those of you attending the forum online, here in Western New York, the day started out rainy with the promise of flowers in May. And now it's a little bit cloudy and cool, though it's, I guess, warming up a bit. And inside Nevins Theater, the Powell Campus Center, it is cozy and the coffee and tea are hot and free. Before starting, we have a few announcements. First, next Thursday's forum will be given by a panel of local public librarians on the challenges of operating a library in an era of book bans and budget cuts. There are some other events this week to announce. Later today in the Palladium room, not the Palladium room for chemistry inclined people. That's room 259 in Binns Merrill Hall. There will be the reintroduction to the Paul Vickers Gardner Glass Center, which enhances education in the art and science of glass for artists, scientists, and glass lovers. Employee recognition awards are still open. See my.alfred.edu for the nomination forms, award types, and award criteria. Nominations are due April 12th. On April 8th, Tuesday of next week, from 3 until 4:30, the AU Wellness Center will host a Narcan, naloxone, and opioid overdose training at the Judson Leadership Center. Participants will receive their own Narcan in addition to this extremely important training that will empower you to potentially save a life. This Saturday from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m., there will be an admissions STEAM Showcase Day event for potentially future Alfred University students. Give anyone you see a warm welcome so they choose Alfred. April 5th and 6th from 12 until 5 p.m. in the non-major space of Carter Hall, there will be a mug making workshop. The MFA thesis exhibitions will open this Saturday and run until May 17th with a new exhibition, I can't talk today, on view each Saturday until the following Tuesday. Free admission, hopefully that got at least one person's attention, to Sophie Treadwell's Mackinac on April 4th, 5th, 11th, and 12th at 7:30 p.m. in the C.D. Smith III Theater. And so without further ado, today's forum will be given by Jeff Sluyter Beltrao, Alfred University Associate Professor of Political Science. The title of the talk is Encounters on the Roads to and Around Istanbul, and is informed by his recent sabbatical. Take it away, Jeff.
Thanks. In fact, you can all hear me okay? The speaker, okay. Well, yeah, thanks for coming. I'm sure you're all exhausted from the celebrations last night for Liberation Day. But today what I hope to do is to combine some travel abroad experiences and scenes with a bit of superficial analysis of Turkish politics. When I first started thinking about this Bergren Forum over a year ago, I decided to focus on the wonderful human connections that my wife Marili and I had made during our 5-month sabbatical journey to Western Europe, Turkey, and Tunisia during the spring semester of 2023. I was going to emphasize the revitalizing sensations those connections had generated in us, how they'd truly given us a renewed faith in humanity, just one amazing moment after another. But I'm a political scientist, and things have been heating up in Turkey in recent weeks. So this past week, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan moved to have Turkey's leading opposition politician, Ekrem İmamoğlu, arrested on trumped-up charges of corruption and terrorism, due in good part to the fact that İmamoğlu had recently surpassed Erdogan in the opinion polls. With the aim then of contributing to a better understanding of what could prove to be a turning point in contemporary Turkish history, there are have been huge mobilizations and protests against what happened to İmamoğlu. I've decided to share with you a brief outsider interpretation of the dynamics of populism in Turkey in combination with some travel scenes and comments. All right, so see if this works. So the trip started off, we actually spent the 3 months in Turkey, 1 month at the end in Tunisia. And the first month, we spent traveling across Western Europe. We were able to do that because we had a number of friends we stayed with in almost every place we stayed with friends. And we got this really nice, cheap train ticket that gives you 7 different trips off one price. So the first place we went to was for Eurosim. I'm a faculty advisor for the Eurosim Club. We went to Wales, and we were based in Swansea. We saw the city of Cardiff. Here are two students, Zuleika Yusuf and Stephanie Borges. And we got to visit the huge cathedral to Rugby in Cardiff, as well as we saw some old, 14th, 15th century tourist sites, a little bit of some of the nice shopping areas in Cardiff. Then we stopped in London. We were there for a couple days, and some of the scenes you're probably familiar with, St. Paul's and the Tower of London, the scene on the Thames. Of course, it was raining cats and dogs the entire time we were there. But we were fortunate enough to meet a friend of Emerson's, Chris Horner, who gave us this tour of London. It was just fantastic. We met him at the oldest working pub in London, the Prospect of Whitby. And Chris was incredibly inquisitive, intelligent, insightful, and just tireless. And so we asked ourselves, why was he hanging out with Emerson? But then we went to Paris, and we stayed with a friend of a friend, Anita, who was also incredible. She gave us, not only did she put us up for 4 days in her flat, but she also when we arrived, she gave us these tickets that gave us a free pass to the entire transportation system of Paris for 4 days, which is hugely helpful. So some of the scenes, we also met up with a friend of mine from grad school, spent the day with them in Montmartre. And yeah, Sacré-Cœur up there on the left. Okay. From there, from Paris, we went to Geneva, where I had studied as a grad student. And one of my best friends in Geneva while I was studying there was this young man, Kerry Couch, and we met his wife, Catherine, there, and stayed with them. But these are some scenes from Geneva. My wife, Marilia, and Catherine hit it off so well. They liked each other better than Kerry and I. After 3 or 4 days, they were like sisters. But some scenes from Geneva. I don't know how many of you might have been there, but there's this beautiful lake, and there's this thing called the Jet d'eau, a huge fountain, and lots of swans. This here down on the right is Calvin's chair. If you ever wanted to sit in Calvin's chair, you can go to Geneva and actually not be allowed to do it. And this picture is actually really important because that there is the longest public bench in the world. We also went to Germany. We spent some time. I had lived in Bavaria on a dairy farm, lived and worked on a dairy farm for 10 months after finishing college. And this is the woman, Christine, that I stayed with on the farm, lived on the farm. And these are some friends of mine who took Marin and me to visit Regensburg, which I had never visited before. It's a really beautiful little Bavarian city on the Danube. And they had built a bridge across the Danube in like the 1200s or something. And it turned Regensburg into a center of the salt trade. And it became a really wealthy and important city at that time. We also visited a museum where you can see, I just took a picture of different things, but this poster of the appeals of the Nazis, which resonate. They're very similar, to a lot of the appeals that we see today, of course. From Bavaria, we went to Florence, Italy, where we stayed with a woman. Oops, sorry. What happened? Okay. Yeah, Lavinia, who I had met on a short 2-day trip to Siena, Italy, back in the early 80s. And we had hit it off. She was really friendly, and we kept in touch by mail. And so I wrote to her before we went to Europe, and I said, we're going to Florence. I didn't even know where she lived, that she lived in Florence, but and I was wondering if we could we meet up for a coffee somewhere, right? And so she said, no, you can come to Florence and stay as long as you want in my mother's apartment. She's not there. She's living with her boyfriend. So her mother's apartment was free. We stayed there in Florence. Again, just amazing. And Lavinia was incredible with her husband, Francesco, taking us out, showing us around. Florence is an amazing, amazing city. My favorite part of Florence is the David. First time I saw it, I was just like so stunned by how incredible it was. But this up on top is my wife Maridia's favorite part of the statue, the face here. And this shot is Susan Mayberry's favorite part. She told me that. I'm not kidding. We then went to Assisi, which is a really beautiful little town in Tuscany where St. Francis lived. Maridia, my wife, just loves St. Francis. And it was incredible because we were there in late January and there were almost no tourists. We had the town to ourselves, and the shopkeepers loved us because they hadn't really seen too many tourists for a while. So, but it's really just another great experience. The last stop then before we made it to Turkey was in Rome. And of course, we went to St. Peter's. We're disgusted by the gold and wealth and stuff, but the Pietà is there, of course. And I had worked in Rome for 2 months back in the 1980s with UPI. I was a sort of a stringer for UPI for 2 months. And my office was right by the Trevi Fountain. And so we revisited it. It seemed to didn't seem as nice as it was back then, even though they've been working on restoring it and such. So we arrived in Istanbul, and a few days before we left Italy, we got an email message saying that our Airbnb rental for 2 months in Istanbul had fallen through, and that they could not provide that place to us. He probably found someone who's going to pay more or something. I don't know. But anyway, we didn't have a place to stay, and we're about to fly to Istanbul. So we contacted every friend we could think of that had contacts in Istanbul. And these two young men, two Palestinian young men, offered their place to us, told us we could stay with them as long as we wanted to until we found another place to stay, which we did after a few days. But we had the traditional makbouba. They made this traditional Palestinian chicken and rice dish, which was delicious. And they were amazing. They greeted us. They picked us up at the train station and carried our bags for like 2 miles. So it was a really welcoming experience. Another one of those connections that just incredible. And here we are the first night, Marida standing on the Golden Horn. It was raining, so there weren't many people out there. It was really beautiful. It was really beautiful to see at night. First time, again, the Golden Horn. All right, so just wanted to say some comments about Turkey then. Turkey has fascinated me since I first visited Istanbul in 2014 as a faculty advisor for a study abroad program from AU. I'd been to lots of amazing cities in my life. I've been very fortunate to travel to cities like London, Paris, Rome, Beijing, Moscow, and Sao Paulo and Mexico City and Buenos Aires in South America. But they all took a back seat for me somehow, almost immediately, to this visually stunning city, sitting astride 2 different continents, built upon multiple historical layers of distinct political cultures, and which at the time, at least in the eyes of an admittedly poorly informed outside observer, seemed to reconcile the tensions between East and West, tradition and modernity, the religious, and the secular in one big tapestry of peaceful, respectful, tolerant human interaction. That's just what I saw in my brief stay there. Just all these different people just getting along without any problem. Okay, so it turns out I sort of missed a bit when it comes to the actual levels of peaceful coexistence in Turkey these days. But my initial experience was in any case one of unforgettable enchantment. My sabbatical allowed me to return to Istanbul, but by then a bit better prepared to understand the city and the country. My wife Marilia and I ended up living in the Eyüp Sultan neighborhood, a devout conservative part of the city. This provided me with an eye-opening contrast to the more secular, westernized neighborhoods I'd experienced back in 2014. One thing that I found particularly helpful in preparing for this second trip was reading Nobel Prize winner Orhan Pamuk's Istanbul, Memories and the City. It awakened me to the need to question my touristic lens and to become more sensitive to the ways local inhabitants might perceive and digest the city. In my favorite chapter of that book, Pamuk writes about a distinctly Turkish state of being called huzun, a deep sense, a deep feeling of loss and the spiritual agony and grief that it entails, he said. This deep sense of anguish, huzun, is said to be central to Istanbul's culture and everyday life. He says that it's, quote, not only a spiritual state, but a state of mind that is ultimately as life-affirming as it is negating. He then begins a lyrical 6-page account of innumerable scenes of daily life in the city that intimate huzun. So I want to read just briefly some excerpts from that, just because I think it's such a great window on the sensations that you have in Istanbul, if you're awake to them. Quote, I'm speaking about huzun, right? I'm speaking of the evenings when the sun sets early, of the old Bosphorus ferries moored to deserted docks in the middle of winter, where sleepy sailors scrub the decks, of the covered women who stand at remote bus stops, clutching shopping bags and speak to no one as they wait for the bus that never arrives, of the children in the streets who try to sell the same tissues to every passerby, of the seagulls perched on rusty barges caked with moss and mussels, unflinching under the pelting rain, of the marble ruins that were for centuries glorious street fountains, but now stand dry, their faucets stolen, of everything being broken, worn out, past its prime. It's by seeing huzun, by paying our respects to its manifestations in the city's streets and views and people, that we at last come to sense it everywhere. So Pamuk admits that other great cities may generate similar feelings of sadness or melancholy, but emphasizes that the difference is that in Istanbul, the remains of a glorious past civilization are everywhere visible. No matter how ill-kept, no matter how neglected, the great mosques and monuments of the city inflict heartache on all who live among them. The people of Istanbul simply carry on with their lives amid the ruins. Many Western writers and travelers find this charming, he writes. But for the city's more sensitive and attuned residents, these ruins are reminders that the present city is so poor and confused that it can never again dream of rising to its former heights of wealth, power, and culture. And so I think it's really, really helpful in getting a sense, it helped me in getting a sense for the city, not just as a tourist, but thinking about how local people, and he's not, of course, necessarily the only view of Istanbul, but at any rate. The other important sort of contextual factor was that the huge earthquake that hit Turkey, you probably remember, in early 2023 in February 6th happened just 3 days after we arrived in Istanbul. And, 50 some thousand Turkish people killed and thousands of Syrians as well. And it was just, it wasn't huzun. It's obviously different from huzun, but the level of anguish and grief you felt everywhere, written on everyone's faces. And, the news for weeks, it shaped the entire sensation in Istanbul, which wasn't even close to, geographically all that close to where the earthquake hit. But everyone has connections to people who were affected there, right? So it was just a really tough time. All right, so I'm gonna shift now to, I want to talk about populism in Turkey. But before I get there, populism arises in the early 20th century in Turkey after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, right? And the Ottoman Empire, it's really important to not to know all the history perhaps, but to have a sense for how the Ottoman Empire was an incredibly complex community or political entity with many, many different ethnicities, right? Different religions. There were Jewish and Christian as well as Muslim communities, for example, in many parts of the empire. Many different languages were spoken. So it was really a complicated thing to keep it together. And there are many factors that shaped the downfall or the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which by the end of the 19th century was called the sick man of Europe, right? But including economic difficulties, attacks from, European imperialism, colonialism, and Russian wars with Russia as well. But the thing I want to emphasize is the rise of nationalism, right? So first Greece in 1820, and then in the Balkans and so forth, the rise of nationalism in different parts of the empire were tearing it apart, often getting external support, right? So by 1914, the empire has declined to a much smaller size and really centered in Anatolia, right? So this area here we refer to as Anatolia, and it would become basically the modern Turkey, right? All right, so populism is going to emerge in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So what is populism? When I say populism, that's a word where it's thrown around a lot, but just to have a sense for it means it's the core is that it sets a pure people against a corrupt elite. It's us versus them, right? Really intense, deep division. Leaders claim to be the voice of a unified will of the people, right? So they claim to speak for the entire population. And it's very reliant on nationalism, often very intense nationalism, right? And they define who is a member of the nation and who isn't, right? Some groups, ethnic groups, it might be along the lines of religion or geography, but they're defining who is a member of the nation as well. Leaders typically have a high level of charisma, and they speak the language of the people, right? They're very effective at knowing how to speak to the common people rather than, political, sophisticated political language and such like most politicians do. Two crucial things that they do typically is that they identify and exaggerate a sense of crisis, right? It's a real contemporary crisis, and they are the ones who know how to solve that crisis, right? And at the same time, they're promising not only will we solve the crisis, we will restore past greatness, this mythic past. Like Mussolini would go look back to the Roman Empire and so forth, right? There's always a mythic past, societal greatness. Okay, so dueling populisms in Turkey. So there are the two most prominent populists in Turkish modern history are Ataturk and Erdogan, right? So on the left here, you see Ataturk, and here Erdogan. Here Erdogan speaking in front of these huge banners, and of course the Turkish flag, right? And this is a photo from recent protests where the protesters who are opposing Erdogan have a big banner of Ataturk. I mean, Ataturk is ever present in the secularist opposition to Erdogan. All right, so I'm going to start then with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's brand of populism. I'm going to try to compare them along similar lines. It's a little bit awkward, but if Ataturk and the Young Turks, the movement that he came out of, they recognized that the Ottoman Empire was done. We have to refound a new type of political system, and they wanted to become a powerful like a powerful Western nation state. They thought that was the way to recover and restore Turkey's greatness. And so they had to take on the Ottoman Empire, and they recognized that in their view, Islam and the Caliphate and so forth, the power of religion in the country was holding Turkey back, right? That it was irrational, superstitious and so forth. They wanted a modern, rational system. So their view of history, when they look back to the Ottoman Empire was derided, marginalized. It was kind of like an unfortunate blip on the longer screen of Turkish history. And they went way back in Turkish history, celebrating the great 16 Turkic tribes. And there was a Turkish history thesis that even argued that Western civilization, if you go back far enough, you discover that Western civilization was rooted in Turkish culture. The characterization of the elites, they saw sort of three different types of enemies or elites, but most important were the Ottoman elites, right? They criticized for being corrupt and holding the country back. So how did they define the nation? Who is a member of the nation? Muslim was part of it, even though they're downplaying the role of religion, right? They're still nonetheless based in the Muslim religious community. So the Christian communities, the Armenians and the Greeks in Turkey were marginalized, seen as part of the enemy grouping, right? So they asked everyone to speak Turkish, which again was complicated. There are all sorts of different languages being spoken at that time in Anatolia. They had to embrace, and crucial also is they had to embrace the reform process. What did that reform process involve? Huge changes, right? The empire was done away with. They abolished the caliphate. They suppressed religious orders like the Tariqat and the Jamaat, which were traditional, long-standing religious orders that organized much of Turkish society at the time. They replaced Sharia law, religious law, with Western legal codes, so forth. These are huge shifts in politics. Cultural reforms were also really important, fascinating. They changed the alphabet, which, think about it, from the sort of Arabic script to a Latin alphabet, meant that people growing up learning to read the Latin alphabet could no longer read their own history, read their family's tombstones, right, monuments, and so forth. So cutting them off from that Ottoman past. And certainly had Turkish surnames. Everyone had to take a Turkish surname. They were shifted from the Muslim to the Gregorian calendar, the metric system. Right? Sunday became the weekly holiday, and the hat law. So the hat law said that the old traditional hats like turbans and the fez could no longer be worn, and that men were to wear Western style hats, right? So this is the kind of the level of imposed changes by the Republican elite or the secularist elite. And just to bring this a little bit to life, I want to read briefly from a couple quotes. So Mustafa Kemal himself at one point accused Ottoman sultans of being, quote, a bunch of madmen, moronic and ignorant animals whose personal rules served only themselves and were indifferent to the people of the nation. The prime minister, the first prime minister of Turkey, Inonu, said, quote, "We are openly nationalists, and nationalism is our only source of unity. Our duty is to make Turkish those who are not Turkish. We will get rid of those who challenge the Turks and Turkishness. The first and foremost thing we require in those who will serve the country is Turkishness." And so the basic idea I want to get across is this, that these shifts towards building this Turkish identity was crucial, right? They viewed that as crucial to building a modern secular nation state, but it was imposed on people who weren't necessarily thrilled with the changes. All right. So Erdogan's, I want to compare it with Erdogan's populism. In between the Republic until the end of World War II was not an electoral democracy. It was basically an authoritarian system. And when with the shift to open elections after World War II, often the parties that won, typically the parties that won were conservative parties who could appeal to people who had problems with the secularist republic. The People's Republican Party of Ataturk was hardly able to win any elections. And then we see this pattern with Erdogan as the system is opening up at the end of the 1990s. It's opening up to an Islamist party. The Welfare Party wins the elections in 1996. Well, it wins the most votes, becomes part of a coalition government, and the Turkish military bans the party. So how does Erdogan is a member of this party, and he responds by creating a new party that would be more moderate, not as in-your-face Islamist. And it's going to be based on this pitch, this populist pitch of Erdogan, which is in direct contrast and countering the secularist Ataturk populism, right? So the core project here now is to get rid of the secularist sectors that dominate society, the political elite and the military, to end the tutelage of the state by the military in particular, reintegrate Islamist principles into the system, their voices and symbols. So the history now shifts, and Erdogan and his people are going to celebrate the Ottoman Empire, right? They're going to criticize the secularist republic for its excesses and shortfalls and so forth. Right? Who are the enemy elites? Now the secularist political class and military leaders in particular. And who are members of the nations are those who are devout Muslims and that embrace Erdogan's Islamicizing reforms. So political reforms in the early years, Erdogan is celebrated in the West by many for holding out the promise of reconciling Islam and democracy, right? After 9/11 and such, this was the Turkish model, right? It seemed to promise a way forward. So the European Union also, there was a possibility that Turkey would be able to gain access to the European Union, but the European Union was demanding democratic reforms, and Erdogan embraced those and pursued them. So he was seen, again, as really the possibility of a democratic Islamic republic. Cultural initiatives supporting now he's supporting religious schools and orders. Headscarves can can be worn in public spaces like universities, efforts to reduce alcohol consumption. And he also pushed forward with cultural rights for the minorities, especially the Kurds in the Kurdish opening. So they had the right to speak their language, teach it in school, their own local television, radio stations and such. Then there's a second phase of Erdogan, however, where he turns in a very different direction. But before I get there, I do want to also give you a sense of Erdogan's populism. So a leading scholar, Toygar Baykan, writes, Erdogan frequently argued that his party represented the nation against, quote, the happy minorities, the privileged classes, and the shadow power holders. While he defined the mission of his party as the liberation of the social segments despised and excluded by people who think they are superior. This is Erdogan in a 2014 speech. He said, "We are in politics for the man who is despised just because he is poor. We are in politics for those with clean hearts who have been ill-treated in hospitals, schools, and government offices. They call us reactionaries because we use God's name to salute each other, just because we pray to God. They look at people from within our nation with contempt, just because they take off their shoes when they enter their homes. They look at us with contempt just because we defend the values of this land." Right? So, and of course, the secularists, you often hear or see, at least with the people that I interacted with, especially in my first day in Turkey, who are secularists, you often hear voices of real contempt and hatred for Erdogan and his movement, right? And so Christopher de Beleg, an investigative journalist, wrote this about the 1990s, which I thought captured this nicely. He said, "I was struck by the hatred with which the secular elite regarded their devout compatriots. Reactionary and retarded were the kinder adjectives that bureaucrats, army officers, and newspaper editors attached to members of banned Islamic brotherhoods or people who sent their children to religious schools." Right? So just, again, these are really deep, intense divisions in Turkey, polarized in good part by these populist appeals on the two sides. So Erdogan, there were always roots, there are always authoritarian dimensions to his rule. 2007, 2008, we can go in more details, but it really takes hold, the consolidation of his authoritarianism, from about 2012, 2013 on. There are big protests against his rule called the Gezi Park protests. There's corruption scandals against him. There are also, there's a coup attempt in 2016. And during these years that were difficult, he faced difficult challenges, he really turned to an more authoritarian type of rule, part of which was achieved through shifting to a presidential system from a parliamentary system. The presidency concentrated many powers in his hands. And that was passed barely, but passed by referendum in 2017. So there are key shifts, though, that also, I think, help explain why this turned to authoritarianism. The economic boom, he had ruled the first 10 years were tremendous economic growth, over 5% a year. And he was able to kind of share that wealth and invest in things that help people. The EU accession talks broke down, so that pressure to democratize wasn't there. Deepening division with Islamist allies, the Gülen movement in particular had been allies of his, and their relationship broke down, and he sought to purge them in their positions. The 2013 Gezi protests, I mentioned, the coup attempt, and the opposition in 2019 showed that it was able to win key elections in big cities. So he's really threatened, and he turns to his new style of rule, where he concentrates power in the presidency, rule by decree, right? So he's marginalizing the legislature. He cleanses the judiciary system and appoints all loyalists to him and controls the judiciary. He expands control over the mainstream media. This is a long-term process, but by this time, he has control of 90% of the media that are loyal to him, pro-Erdogan, arresting journalists, harassing them. He purges the state administration and the police after the coup attempt. He arrests opposition leaders and rights advocates, and so forth. And he even ousts elected mayors and replaces them with people loyal to him. So, and the erosion of the rule of law. But just to capture this turn, this authoritarian turn, Susie Hansen, who is a wonderful journalist for the New York Times, wrote about this shift. She wrote, Erdogan had made himself the West's great hope for the Muslim world. But in the last year, she's writing 2014, in the last year, a thoroughly different Erdogan has emerged as a symbol of authoritarianism, corruption, and police brutality, whose populist rhetoric has turned into thundering rage. Erdogan's response to the threats posed by the protests and corruption charges has been to punish those he considers disloyal. Critics of Erdogan are called traitors or terrorists, or more colorfully, assassins. Right? So the question is, in the end, why would Erdogan still have a fairly broad base of support? And we don't know exactly how broad, but somewhere around half of the population still seems to support him. So why would that be? And the kind of studies the understanding I've been trying to come to of that through my experiences there, as well as through reading and study, is his mastery of the populist style is still very effective. A lot of Turkish people find that strongman appeal very convincing still. He has a way of talking to people that nobody else, at least as far as I know, nobody else is capable of matching. His party's unparalleled grassroots organization, the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, has incredible system of support at the local levels throughout Turkey, every corner, every village. Well, not every village, I'm sure, but just an incredible grassroots mobilization capacity. And he's downplayed the Islamism and has relied more and more on nationalism. He has an alliance with an ultra-nationalist political party now. And he sells himself in elections. We were there during the run-up to the 2023 presidential elections. The advertising was often focusing on the great things he'd done for the military, the building of drones, and they have an aircraft carrier on the way and this and that. So it's a lot of building the military power of Turkey. And then finally, the legacies of his unprecedented government spending on infrastructure. This is something that, like a friend of mine in Eyüp Sultan, who supported Erdogan, always emphasized that Erdogan had shown the people that he actually wanted to improve their lives, working people's lives. And he invested heavily in transportation, healthcare, education, housing. And people don't forget that, even though the economic crisis has reduced the capacity to do those things. An example of that is the healthcare system. I unfortunately experienced the healthcare system several times. Was in hospitals and always came away from it impressed. And I won't read it to you, but there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine was one of my sources. I did some research on the healthcare system, and the party really did transform the healthcare system, turn it into a universal system with much greater access, much wider access, and supported by people. Positive surveys done revealed that a much greater percentage of the population was satisfied with, happy with their healthcare system than 10 or 12 years before. So that's sort of the overview of populism. I don't know if it's sort of 1 o'clock. I don't know, should I, because I did have some maybe if for those of you who can't, if you need to leave, go ahead and take off. But I just quickly show some scenes from Istanbul, which I was hoping to have time for. This is Eyüp Sultan, the area of Istanbul that we live. The Eyüp Sultan Mosque. Oops, sorry. The Eyüp Sultan Mosque here is one of the most important mosques in the Muslim world. They say in Turkey, they say it's the 4th most important mosque after Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock. But here, this scene from a little cemetery near the mosque, they have an entire neighborhood set up for cats. Turks love cats, and you see cats everywhere, the most beautiful cats you've ever seen in your life. With cats everywhere in Istanbul. And this is a view from a cemetery looking back at the mosque. But Eyüp Sultan, again, is right on the Golden Horn waterway. Glances at some different scenes around Istanbul here. Marilya, one of the shop markets. They have incredible markets that go on for just seemingly miles, markets, all this stuff. This is the old Theodosian walls. They were built in like the 400s, 5th century. And they were famous for a double wall structure. They had these two huge walls and then a moat. And they were just basically impregnable. And these walls, which you can still see sections of around Istanbul, were crucial to the defense of Constantinople when for 1,000 years, the Byzantines were able to ward off attacks and sieges and so forth. But the walls were crucial to that success. This here is another Balat, another beautiful little part of Istanbul. This is in Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia was built on the first one was built in the 4th century. This version was built in the 6th century under Justinian, and it's just an incredible place. It's had many different identities over the centuries, from Orthodox Christian to Catholic. During a period of the Crusades, it was Catholic. Then it went back to being Orthodox Christian, then became Muslim when Mehmet the Conqueror conquered Constantinople in 1453. Then it became a Muslim mosque. Minarets were built, and a Quranic script on the walls and such. Many of the beautiful mosaics were covered over. But and most recently, under the Republican secularist elite, under Ataturk, it became a museum, a secular museum. And then Erdogan, just 5 years ago, returned it to being a mosque. Again, playing this is a huge symbol, right? A secular symbol or a religious symbol, and play a sort of a political move. And this is the Basilica Cistern, which is a really incredible, huge cistern. It's the largest cistern of the old ancient cisterns in Istanbul, which played a crucial role in the defense of the city. When Constantinople was under siege, you needed water supply, and this held 3 million cubic feet of water. They've turned it into a tourist spot now, but these columns, there are 336 columns. I think it's 12 rows of 28 columns, and they have this amazing lighting now. It shifts different colors and such. All of the columns were reused columns that had been columns on big public buildings that became ruins, and they salvaged the columns and put them down in the Basilica Cistern. Right? This is in secular Istanbul. Here is my friend Toygar Baykan, who's a tremendous young scholar of populism. He took me to a great Turkish restaurant. This is up near Taksim Square. It's sort of the political center of the secular area of Istanbul, Istiklal Caddesi, the main thoroughfare for shopping and so forth, with a nice tram in the middle. And this, anybody know what this is? The Pera Palace, where there's a great TV show. If you haven't seen it, the first season is excellent, Pera Palace. And you get really attached to this hotel, which plays it. In the show, they have it play an important role in the independence struggle after World War I. But and these are great friends of ours. This guy in the middle, Çağatay, he basically saved my life. I mentioned some medical problems, and if it hadn't been for Çağatay and my wife Marilia, I would have been in big trouble. But he took me to a hospital. You know, it's very difficult when you're in pain and can barely speak any Turkish to explain your problem. So Çağatay played a big role there. And these friends of ours were in Eyüp Sultan, family that took us here. We were celebrating Ramadan, celebrating Iftar, I should say, at the end of the day one day. And this family, Fatma, and Sumaira, and Yusuf, were just incredible, helping us. Every day we'd come home. So many days we'd come home and there'd be food sitting there waiting for us. It's just too much. Turkish hospitality, Turkish warmth is just incredible. It's an incredible experience. They also showed us a lot of different things around the city. And then we went to Fethiye. These are the last few slides. And we went to Fethiye, which is a beautiful tourist town on the western coast, southwestern coast of Turkey. And here again, you see the cats And if you eat dinner, often cats will, cats are allowed to roam wherever they want to go. And they'll often join you for a meal, hoping you'll share with them. And of course, Marilia may have given a piece or two, and then more come and stay. But anyway, so it's a beautiful place, Fethiye. And here's some of the summer tourist hotspots. No, Fethiye as a summer tourist hotspot. We were there in April. It was still a little bit cool, but you see some of the funny things they have. The phone booth, the duck phone booth. This is where you can put bottles in or whatever and get dog food or cat food, right? Turks love to, they'll leave extra food after dinner. They'll leave it out for the cats and the dogs outside their door city. Right? And this really is upsetting. New York, the hat law. What happened with the hat law? I think it needs to be revised. And proper Red Sox hats. And Fethiye is also a big Ataturk stronghold. So walking in the public areas, you see pictures of him. Like these are all different. This is with the literacy campaign, with the new alphabet. Nice Western dress, hero of the War of Independence and such, right? And the party. These are monuments. Ataturk in the middle here takes precedence over all the other great leaders of Turkish history. In Fethiye also, there are mountain walls outside the city of Fethiye, which were back from Lycian times. Lycia was an ancient federation of 23 different towns and cities. And it was the model that this federation was a model for the US federal system cited by the founders. But one of the towns was called Telmessos at the time, had these huge, incredible wall tombs. And there are many of them throughout the entire Lycian Federation area. But they're up high. You have to walk up high just to get to them. And they're up high in the walls. And we believe, the people who have studied them believe that what they were up there for was to get closer to the afterlife so that when the winged creatures came down and to get them, it would be easier for them to make it to the afterlife. I'm not sure, how accurate that would be. But really fascinating these tombs. And then also we were in Fethiye initially for 9 or 10 days, and then we went to a smaller village where we had friends that we stayed with for several weeks in Kayaköy. And in Kayaköy, on the edge of Kayaköy is an old abandoned village, which was called Levisi. It was Greek. And this gets back at that complicated history. See these layers of history, right? With the wall tombs, with the Theodosian walls, and with this village in Kayaköy. It was a village of about 10,000 Greek Orthodox Christians who lived at peace with their neighbors, their neighboring Turks at the time. But after the War of Independence, the Greeks were seen as a threat, right? A fifth column, and Greece had conquered briefly parts of Western Turkey. And so they were seen as enemies. And there was a big exchange, transfer of population. And this entire village was forced to go to what is now part of Macedonia, right? And you walk around this village and this abandoned village, and you just there's a strange feeling. Anyway, it's kind of beautiful in a way, but just left there abandoned in ruins with trees growing up in the middle of them. Anyway, so that's
Hate to cut it short, but it is 1:10. So if anybody has questions for Jeff, please go on up and ask those questions. But let's thank Jeff for an awesome talk. Hope to see you next week.
If anybody has a question or a comment, Hakan, you must have a comment.